I woke up a little after 6 in the morning, like I had every day since moving into my daughter's house. The room I stayed in was all the way at the end of the hallway, tiny, with just one small window, barely enough for the first light of dawn to slip through. At this hour, when the whole house was still quiet, you could always hear the faint creaking of the old water pipes and the steady humming of the refrigerator downstairs in the kitchen. I pushed myself up to sit on the edge of the bed, stretched my back a little to ease the stiffness, then put on my flannel sweater, worn thin at the elbows. When I was done, I folded the blanket carefully, the exact way Harold, my husband, used to do. Then I looked down at my wristwatch. It was the last thing he left me, the only thing I carry with me every single day. Sometimes, when the sunlight slants in through the window and lands on the face of the watch, I almost feel as if Harold's hand is still there, gently fastening the strap around my wrist like he used to. I walked down the stairs slowly so I wouldn't wake Nia. In the kitchen, I opened the fridge and took out some beef, a few carrots, and a big onion. Whenever I have the chance, I make the stew my daughter loves most. Ever since she was a tiny little girl, Nia has adored the smell of it. She always said it reminded her of our Sundays together. I set the cutting board on the counter and began chopping the vegetables while the small radio I'd brought with me murmured the morning news at low volume, the clink of the knife against the board, the announcer's voice, almost a whisper. That was how I started my mornings, a familiar, gentle rhythm that made me feel like I was still useful in this house. Then I heard footsteps behind me. Bryson walked past the kitchen without bothering to say hello. He grimaced as if something in the air smelled disgusting, then muttered that the smell in the kitchen was too strong. I calmly replied that this was the stew Nia had loved since she was little, but Bryson didn't care. He just kept walking straight ahead, huffing, as if my presence in this kitchen were some kind of stubborn, ongoing nuisance. I put the vegetables into the pan with a bit of oil. As the aroma began to rise, warm, familiar, I lifted the lid of the pot and used the ladle to stir the meat so it wouldn't stick to the bottom. Right then, Bryson came back. This time, he had his phone in hand, his frown even deeper. It looked like he was in the middle of a video call, and the sound of the ladle hitting the pot was annoying him. "Can you stop making noise?" he said, his voice louder than necessary. I apologized and turned the heat down, trying not to make any more sound, but Bryson walked straight up to the stove, took a breath of the air, then wrinkled his nose as if he'd just smelled something horrible. "This kitchen smells awful. Don't turn this house into some cheap diner." I gently replied that I would put the lid back on and open the window so the smell wouldn't spread. I hadn't even finished my sentence when he yanked the ladle out of my hand, with such force that I almost lost my balance. Before I could react, he flipped the ladle over and pressed the metal part, still hot, against the back of my hand. I heard a dry little sound, like my skin giving off a faint sizzle. A sharp stabbing pain shot straight up my arm, making me drop the dish towel I was holding in my other hand. A bit of stew splashed out, dirtying the edge of the stovetop. I stood completely still, trying to keep my breathing slow so it wouldn't turn into a sound. Right then, Nia walked down the stairs in her bathrobe. She saw me cradling my reddened hand, saw the ladle lying crooked in the sink, and her eyes widened with worry. "What happened, Mom?" she asked, hurrying toward me. But before I could open my mouth, Bryson cut in. "Your mom almost burned the house down. She doesn't know how to cook, Nia." I tried to play everything down, saying I was just making the stew like I always do. But Bryson looked at me with the same expression he always used whenever he wanted to make me feel small and useless. Nia looked at my hand, saw clearly the red mark swelling there, but she didn't say a word. Her eyes flicked over to Bryson, as if asking for permission to speak up. Bryson threw her a glare so sharp that Nia froze and stepped back exactly one pace. Then he walked over to the radio and switched it off with a snap. "Do it over," he said, his voice flat and cold. "And this time, do it right." He tossed the ladle into the sink as if it were trash. I bent down, picked up the dish towel, and started wiping the stovetop again, trying to smother the burning pain that was still throbbing on my skin. But of everything that had just happened, the thing that hurt most wasn't the burn on my hand. It was the look in my daughter's eyes, standing there, watching it all, and choosing to stay silent. If you've ever watched someone keep quiet when they should have defended you, then you know exactly how I felt that morning. But this was only the beginning. In the next part, you'll see that what Bryson did afterward was far worse, and that very moment is what pushed my life onto a completely different path. Don't step away from this story. What comes next will leave you choked up. Maybe I should tell you about the time before everything became twisted, before I turned into an extra in my own family. There was a time when I had everything: a home, a decent husband, and a life overflowing with laughter. My name is Margaret Ailey, 68 years old. For 40 years, I lived in South Shore, Chicago, with the man of my life, Eugene Ailey. Eugene was not rich. He was just a plumber. In the early years when we were dating, his hands always smelled like grease and industrial soap, but he was the kindest man I had ever met. He never forgot our anniversary. He never forgot to buy yellow roses, my favorite flower. We got married in 1978 in a small church in Hyde Park. I wore a simple cream dress, and Eugene wore the only brown suit he owned. There was no extravagant wedding reception, just family, a few friends, and a homemade wedding cake baked by my cousin. But it was still the happiest day of my life. A year later, Nia was born. I still remember the exact moment the nurse placed her in my arms. She was so tiny, her skin dark and glossy like Eugene's, her big round eyes looking up at me as if I were the entire world. Eugene sat beside me, holding my hand, tears rolling down his cheeks like a little boy. "This is our daughter, Maggie," he whispered. "We will protect her until our last breath." And we did exactly that. Nia grew up in a brown-roofed 2-story house in South Shore. Eugene grew tomatoes in the yard, and I grew roses. Every Sunday morning, I made beef stew, the dish Nia had loved since she was little. She would stand on a stool, her tiny hands holding a wooden spoon to help me stir the pot. "Mom, why is this so good?" she would ask, eyes sparkling. "Because I put love in it, sweetheart." I would laugh and kiss the top of her head. Eugene sat at the table, reading the newspaper and watching the two of us, his eyes full of pride. "My 2 girls. I am the luckiest man alive," he would always say. At that time, I had no idea those happy memories would become the only thing keeping me standing in the dark years that followed. And I also did not know that Bryson would walk into my life like a storm strong enough to sweep away the things I treasured most. But life was never easy. Eugene worked from early morning until late at night. Some nights he would come home at 9 or 10, completely exhausted. I worked part-time at a laundromat to help with the rent. Even so, our family always kept one rule. We had dinner together, never skipped. When Nia was 10, Eugene taught her how to ride a bike. I remember so clearly the sight of him running behind the bike, his hand gripping the back of the seat, shouting, "Pedal, baby! Pedal harder!" Nia laughed out loud, her hair flying in the wind. When Eugene finally let go, she went a few more meters before falling over. He ran over and picked her up. "You did it! You did it, sweetheart!" I stood on the porch, wiping away tears. Not because she fell, but because I knew that moment would stay with her for the rest of her life. But when Nia turned 25, things began to change. She met Bryson Watkins at a company event. A man in finance, wearing expensive suits, driving a luxury car, talking as if he was constantly sizing people up. The first time she brought him home, Eugene and I both tried to be friendly. "Nice to meet you, Bryson," Eugene said, extending his hand. Bryson shook it, but his eyes swept over our small house as if he were scoring it. "Nice place," he said, but his tone lacked any real sincerity. Nia did not notice. She was in love, and when people are in love, they often do not see the warning signs. A year later, they got married. The wedding was held at a fancy hotel in downtown Chicago. I wore my nicest blue dress, and Eugene wore a brand new suit. But the entire reception, I felt like I did not belong there. Bryson's family, wealthy white folks from the North Side, looked at us as if we were uninvited guests. Bryson's mother could not even remember my name. She called me the bride's mother the whole evening. Eugene held my hand tightly. "Don't worry, Maggie. As long as Nia is happy, that's what matters." But I could see it in Nia's smile. It never quite reached her eyes. 2 years later, Eugene passed away, lung cancer. Terminal stage. The doctor said he had 6 months, but he only lasted 3. In those final days, I sat by his hospital bed, holding his hand. His body had grown thin, his skin cold and dry, but his eyes were still as gentle as ever. "Maggie," he whispered, "I'm sorry I have to leave you alone." "Don't say that," I cried. "You're going to be okay." But we both knew the truth. "Promise me one thing," Eugene said, squeezing my hand tighter. "Don't let anyone treat you badly. You deserve respect. Never forget that." He passed away on a March morning, when snow still blanketed the rooftops. Nia and I held his hands until his very last breath. After the funeral, life fell into a vast emptiness. The house was too quiet. I could not sleep in the bedroom Eugene and I had shared for 40 years. I moved down to the sofa in the living room. Nia visited every week. She urged me to move in with her. "Mom, you shouldn't live alone. Come stay with us." At first, I refused. But the utility bills piled up. The house deteriorated. And above all, there was the loneliness. Something that clings to a widow like a shadow. I agreed. "Just for a while," I told Nia. "Once I find a job, I'll move out." She hugged me, smiling so gently. "You can stay as long as you want, Mom." But the moment I moved into their apartment in Bronzeville, I knew I had made a mistake. Bryson did not want me there. He did not say so. He did not have to. I saw it in his eyes, in the way he sighed every time I walked into a room, in the comments he made just loud enough for me to hear, "When is your mom going to leave?" And day by day, I became an outsider in my own family. Bryson didn't burn my hand from the very beginning. No. Abuse never starts with violence. It always starts with light words, strange looks, little moments that make you wonder, am I overreacting? During the first week after I moved in, Bryson still acted polite. "Hello, Aunt Margaret," he said in a neutral tone. "If you need anything, just let me know." But by the second week, his tone changed. One afternoon, I was cooking in the kitchen when Bryson walked in, glanced at the pot boiling on the stove, and frowned. "What's that smell?" "Beef stew," I said. "Nia likes this dish." "Yeah, but we don't. Next time, make sure you ask before you cook something that smells like this." I stood there with the ladle in my hand, feeling as if I had done something wrong, even though this was my daughter's home. Yet somehow, he made me feel like I was intruding on my own family's space. By the third week, Bryson started laying down rules. "You shouldn't use the living room after 8 p.m. I need a quiet space to work. And please don't turn the TV up too loud. It distracts me. And another thing, do the laundry at night for me. The washing machine is too loud during the day." I swallowed my objections back down my throat. I told myself, I'm just a guest. I have to respect their space, but things just kept escalating. One morning I got up early to make coffee. Bryson walked in, looked at the cup of coffee I had poured for myself, and raised an eyebrow. "Do you know that specialty coffee I ordered from Colombia? It's not cheap." I froze. "I'm sorry, I didn't know." "Of course you didn't," he cut me off. "You never ask before using other people's things." From that day on, I stopped drinking coffee entirely. I only dared to drink water. Then Bryson started counting the food. One day, I took an apple from the fridge. He looked at me as if I had just stolen an entire safe full of gold. "That's organic apples. $12 a bag. If you want fruit, you should buy your own." My face burned hot. "I'm sorry, I'll buy more to replace it." "No need," he said, his voice sweet as honey, but sharp as a knife. "But next time, ask first." Nia stood in the bedroom doorway, hearing everything. She looked at me with apologetic eyes, but still didn't say a word. That was when I realized my daughter was afraid of her own husband. That truth, it slipped into the middle of my chest like a cold draft I knew Bryson was controlling. But I had never imagined he could make my daughter, the child I had raised with gentle love, fall so silent. I didn't yet know this was only the beginning, that what lay ahead would be far worse. In the weeks that followed, Bryson began belittling me right in front of Nia. "You don't know how to fold towels?" One day he held up the towel I had just folded. "Look at this, it's all wrinkled. You put the dishes in the wrong place. Big bowls go on the bottom, small ones on top. Stop dragging your slippers across the wooden floor. It leaves scratches." Each time I apologized. Each time I tried to do better, but somehow I was never enough. One night I heard them arguing in the bedroom. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but the walls were too thin. "You can't let your mom stay here forever," Bryson said, his voice icy. "This isn't a nursing home." "My mom has nowhere else to go," Nia said, her voice trembling. "You just need to be patient." "Patient?" Bryson laughed. "I've been patient, but I can't live in my own house and have to tiptoe around because of some old woman." Nia burst into tears. "Don't talk about my mom like that." "It's the truth. She's a burden, and sooner or later, you'll have to choose, me or your mother." That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, crying silently, not because of what Bryson said, but because I knew my daughter would not stand on my side, and I was right. The morning Bryson burned my hand with the hot ladle was only the breaking point of many months of emotional abuse. I stood at the sink, letting cold water run over the burn. The water eased the pain a little, but did nothing for the ache inside. Nia walked in, looked at my hand, and sighed. "Are you okay, Mom?" she asked, her voice soft as a breeze. I nodded, not daring to meet her eyes. I was afraid that if I looked, I would cry, and I didn't want her to see me weak. "I'm sorry," Nia said. "Bryson's under a lot of pressure at work. He didn't mean it." Didn't mean it. 3 weightless words, enough to excuse an act of violence. "Sweetheart," I said, my voice trembling. "That wasn't an accident. He looked straight into my eyes when he did it." Nia went silent. She didn't know what to say, or didn't want to say it. Bryson appeared in the doorway, his eyes cold as steel. "Nia, I need to talk to you. Right now." Nia looked at me, then followed her husband. The bedroom door closed. I stood alone in the cold kitchen, staring at the angry red burn on my hand. And for the first time since Eugene died, I asked myself, is this life still worth living? The next day, Bryson handed me a stack of papers. "These are the house rules," he said, his voice dry as stone. "If you want to live here, you follow them." I took the papers with my good hand, the others still wrapped in bandages. Printed on them, in cold, bold letters, were the words, "No using the kitchen after 8 p.m., no using the living room, no making noise while he is working, no using the washer or dryer during peak hours, must pay for your own food and personal items." I looked up. "What is this?" I asked. "Rules," Bryson replied shortly. "Nia will sign them tonight. You can ask yourself how long you can handle this." I tried to stay calm. "I want to talk to Nia first before I sign anything," I said. Bryson sighed, as if I had just demanded some special privilege. "Hurry up," he said. That evening, Nia came home close to 7, looking exhausted. The moment she stepped through the door, Bryson pulled her into the bedroom and slammed the door shut. I stood in the kitchen, pretending to scrub the sink over and over, though it was already clean. The walls were thin. Nothing inside stayed hidden. First came Bryson's voice, cold and sharp. Then Nia's voice, crying and trying to speak. And then the sentence that sliced straight into my chest. Either she goes, or I go. You choose. I stared at the sink without really seeing it anymore. The bedroom door opened. Bryson came out first, carrying my suitcase, and set it neatly by the front door like a parcel being returned. Nia followed behind, her eyes swollen and red, her hand still clutching her phone. She walked up to me, her voice so small it felt like it might break. "Mom, maybe it would be better if you found somewhere else to stay for a few days, just until things calm down." "You want me to leave?" I asked. Nia looked down. She didn't say yes, but she didn't say no either. Bryson immediately cut in. "This place isn't big enough for 3 adults, especially one who doesn't respect other people's space." He took out his wallet and shoved a wad of cash into my hand. $200, a cheap hotel, is more than enough. Don't say I never helped you." I looked at the daughter I'd carried and birthed, raised with every meal, every sleepless night. Now she stood there, eyes red and puffy, unable to look her own mother in the eye. "Sweetheart." That was as far as I got before my voice broke. Nia's lips parted, but Bryson put a hand on her shoulder. The gesture looked comforting from the outside, but it was enough to make her lower her head and swallow whatever she'd been about to say. I stared at the suitcase for a long moment. Finally, I said quietly, "I don't want to cause any more trouble. I'll go. Today." Bryson had already opened the door, jerking his chin toward it. "Go. It's getting dark. Not my fault," he said. The sound of the suitcase wheels bumping over the threshold was the last thing I heard before the door closed behind me. Final, like a sentence being passed. The sky had already dimmed. The streetlights flicked on. For the first time in my life, I stood outside a door with nowhere left to go. My phone was down to just a few % battery, not enough to order a ride. I pulled my suitcase toward the bus stop. When the bus came, I paid the fare and sat by the window, watching the city lights slide past. The bus went through neighborhoods where Eugene and I had once fixed pipes, scrubbed people's kitchens. Now it all just slipped by, as if it had never been part of my life at all. I got off downtown and started looking for budget hotels. First one, no vacancies. Second one, full. Third one, still no room. Eventually, I found myself standing in a small park across from the public library. I chose the least dirty stone bench, set my suitcase by my feet, and sat down. The cold hit me immediately. I pulled my coat tighter around me, trying to close my eyes for a few minutes, just so I wouldn't have to think if someone had walked past at that moment. They probably would have thought, "That woman must have been on the streets for a long time." But the truth was, yesterday, I was still the mother-in-law living with her daughter in a decent apartment. Today, I was the woman curled up on a park bench, with no idea where she would sleep that night. Near midnight, an older woman with a hunched back and messy white hair pushed an old shopping cart past me. She stopped, lifted a finger in greeting. "I'm Rosa," she said, her voice hoarse. "Used to be a nurse, long time ago." "I'm Margaret," I replied. "I don't have anything to share if you're asking about food." Rosa rummaged through her bag, pulled out half a stale baguette, and handed it to me. "Eat," she said. "It's cold tonight. If you don't have something in your stomach, you won't get up tomorrow morning." I took it, more grateful than words could say. The bread was dry and hard, but it was warmer than anything else I had. "Sometimes the cops come around 4 a.m., Rosa went on. "They hate seeing us on the benches. If you want to sleep without being chased off, come with me." I pulled my suitcase along behind her to the library's overhang. A few other people were already lying on flattened cardboard. Rosa laid out another piece. "Lie here. It's not comfortable, but it's better than the bench." I lay down, pulling my coat up over my face, listening to the cars, the coughing, the rattle of a can rolling somewhere. The burned hand throbbed under my sleeve. I took out my phone and quickly typed a message to Nia. "I'm okay. Take care of yourself, my love." No reply came. I turned the phone off to save what little battery was left, then stared up at the dark underside of the awning. That night, I understood one thing. The distance between having a home and being homeless is sometimes nothing more than a sheet of house rules, a suitcase set by the door, and a loved one turning away. After that night sleeping huddled under the library awning, I woke up with my whole body numb and my throat burning dry. Rosa gently tapped my shoulder. "Let's go, Margaret. The church on the corner serves breakfast until 9. If we don't go early, there'll be no bread left." We pulled our suitcases along for 2 blocks until we reached a gray church with a white cross at the entrance. In the yard, there was a long line of people, torn backpacks, old coats, carts piled with whatever they had left. The air carried the faint smell of cheap coffee and toast. A young volunteer with a red scarf asked if I needed a scarf. "1 scarf," I said. She handed me a light gray scarf, neatly folded, as if she were giving me something precious. I received my breakfast tray. 2 slices of toast, a bit of peanut butter, a cup of watery coffee, then sat down on the church steps. I looked around. Elderly people wrapped in blankets, young men with empty eyes, women holding children. Yesterday I had still been staying with my daughter. Today I was standing in line for a free breakfast. Rosa quietly told me she would look for another place to sleep that night because the police usually clear out the downtown area at dawn. I nodded. At that moment, any practical advice felt precious. Before leaving, I opened my suitcase to rearrange my things. In a small compartment, my hand brushed against Eugene's brown coat. The one he wore every winter. I lifted it up, and a yellow envelope fell to my feet. On the corner of the envelope was Eugene's round, steady handwriting. I sat down by a tree trunk and opened the envelope. My hands were shaking from the cold and from a strange, nameless sense of foreboding. Inside was a letter and a neatly folded stack of documents. I had only managed to read the first line. "If you are reading this, it means I can't tell you this in person." When a staff member from the church came out to announce that they needed to clear the yard to prepare for Mass, I quickly slipped the letter into my coat pocket and followed Rosa out. We went back near the library and chose a quiet bench. I took the letter out and opened it with both hands. Eugene's voice seemed to rise from the lines on the page. "Margaret, my love, your whole life, you have taken care of everyone else and always put yourself last. You are not weak because you are kind. You are not lesser because you sacrifice. For 30 years, I have quietly invested in a few small properties, not to show off, but to make sure my wife would never have to beg anyone for a roof over her head. You took care of me until my last breath. Now let me take care of you, even when I am no longer here. You deserve respect, Maggie. Never let anyone make you forget that. With all my love, Eugene." My vision blurred. I blinked over and over so I could keep reading the stack of documents attached. They were property ownership certificates. I counted them again. 13. 13 properties, all of them in the name of Margaret Ann Ale. The husband I had always thought was just an ordinary plumber, had quietly built an entire portfolio of assets over 3 decades without ever saying a word to me. Then my eyes stopped on a name printed on one of the documents. Bronzeville Apartments, the building where Naya and Bryson were living. My stomach clenched. How could I be the owner of the building my son-in-law had just thrown me out of like trash? I ran my hand over the address line once, twice, 3 times to make sure I wasn't misreading it. If someone walked past at that moment, they would have only seen a homeless old woman clutching a stack of wrinkled papers on her lap. They would not have known it was 13 properties, 30 years of quiet hard work, and the love of a husband who never bragged. Rosa came back and saw me holding the paperwork, my eyes wide. "What you got there?" she asked. "Just some things my husband left me. Memories," I replied, quickly putting some of the documents away. "Keep them safe," Rosa warned. "Out here, if people see you holding papers, someone might try to take them." I tucked everything into the inside pocket of my coat and pulled the zipper up. Right then, a light drizzle began to fall. We ran back under the library awning. I set the stack of papers on my lap, bent over them, and used the gray scarf to gently wipe each damp edge. The smell of wet paper made my heart race. as if I were trying to preserve the last pieces of my life. When I checked my phone, there were only 4% battery left. I asked Rosa if there was any place to charge it. She led me to a bus stop and showed me a hidden outlet under the metal bench. While waiting for the phone to charge, I opened the paperwork again. On the last page, one name was underlined: Clarence Kimball, attorney, along with a phone number. My heart started pounding again. He was probably the only person who could explain all of this. When the battery reached about 7%, I dialed the number and held the phone to my ear. "Yes, this is Margaret Ale," I said. "I believe you once knew my husband, Eugene." There was silence on the other end for a moment. Then a man's voice came through, clearer. "Margaret, is it really you? We've been trying to find you for the past 6 months. Where are you?" I looked around. The damp bus stop, puddles shining under the gray sky. "I'm at a bus stop downtown," I said. The answer sounded strange, even to me. "Don't go anywhere," he replied, his voice suddenly urgent. "We're sending someone to pick you up right now." I hung up, my heart still racing. Rosa asked, "You okay?" "I have to meet an old acquaintance," I said, though I didn't fully understand what was happening myself. About 25 minutes later, a black sedan pulled up in front of the bus stop. A man in a dark suit stepped out, holding a briefcase and a small sign with my name on it. "Mrs. Ale?" he asked. "I'm from Mr. Kimball's office. He's waiting for you." He picked up my suitcase, opened the back door, and invited me into the car as if it were the most natural thing in the world. As the door closed and my still damp coat brushed against the seat, one very clear thought crossed my mind. Maybe my story isn't over at all. Maybe everything is only just beginning. The black sedan glided along streets I knew by heart. Back in the day, I used to walk these very sidewalks carrying a toolbox, bending under sinks, fixing every leaking pipe in the houses around here. I never imagined I would return to these avenues like this, sitting in the back seat of a sleek car with a driver in a suit opening the door for me. The car stopped in front of a large glass building in Chicago's financial district. Inside was the smell of polished marble, hurried footsteps, people carrying leather folders and expensive backpacks. And there I was, a woman who had slept on a piece of cardboard the night before, standing there in worn shoes and a frayed coat, feeling like I had wandered into someone else's world. The receptionist checked Clarence Kimball's business card, nodded, and pointed us toward the elevator. 14th floor, a quiet hallway, thick carpet, black and white photographs on the walls. The driver knocked on the door of 1447. Clarence opened almost immediately. Gray suit, graying hair, thin-rimmed glasses, eyes steady and calm. "Mrs. Ale," he said, shaking my hand firmly. "It's good to finally meet you." The office smelled of polished wood. Large desk, shelves full of files, a window looking out over downtown. Seeing that my hands were still trembling, Clarence poured some hot water, dropped a tea bag into the cup. "Have something warm to drink," he said. "You're safe now." I set Eugene's envelope and the stack of documents I'd been clutching all night onto the desk. Clarence took them, checked each page, cross-referencing them on his computer. A few minutes later, he looked up. "Everything matches," he said. "You are the legal owner of 13 properties." I sat in silence. For someone who had just spent her first night homeless, that sentence felt like it came from another world altogether. Clarence explained that they had been looking for me for many months, calling my old house, reaching out to where Nia lived, sending letters. But everything ended with Bryson, who never once provided a real phone number or address for me. Hearing a stranger confirm this made my chest tighten. He opened the safe and took out a thick file. "This is the complete history of the properties: purchase contracts, repair records, lease agreements, personal notes. Your husband was very meticulous." I flipped through a notebook filled with Eugene's familiar handwriting, lists of expenses, tenants' names, little notes about leaky roofs, heating systems, pipes that needed replacing. 30 years of him quietly building, never boasting, just so I wouldn't have to work until my back broke and still worry about paying bills. Clarence hesitated, then asked, "Let me ask you directly. Where are you staying right now?" I answered softly, "Outside. I slept outdoors last night." His expression changed instantly. He stood up, made a quick, decisive phone call, then came back to me. "You can't go on like this. A car will take you to a hotel immediately. This is not a favor. This is the bare minimum you deserve." From the office, the sedan took me to the Chicago Grand, a hotel I had only ever dared to look at from across the street. The receptionist handed me a key card. "Executive Suite, 19th floor. We wish you a pleasant stay." The door opened. The room was spacious and bright, with crisp white sheets, a marble bathroom, a balcony overlooking the Chicago skyline. I stood in the doorway, taking a few seconds before stepping in fully, as if I were afraid that if I moved too quickly, it would all disappear. I drank a bottle of cold water, picked up a fresh apple, and felt strange. Just the night before, I had been eating dry bread under the library awning. Now, I was standing in a hotel bathroom, letting hot water from the shower cascade down my back, over my hands still marked by the burn. The cold, the street dust, and part of the humiliation of that homeless night seemed to wash away. After stepping out of the bathroom, wrapped in a towel, I sat on the edge of the bed and turned on my phone. No messages, no missed calls from Nia. I had known it would be like that, but my chest still ached as if someone were squeezing it tight. I called the front desk and asked to have my clothes laundered, including the old coat that had followed me through my nights on the street. That evening, I ate cream soup, garlic butter toast, and roast chicken in the hotel restaurant. I ate slowly, as if my stomach didn't quite believe there would be another meal. At the end of the meal, Clarence called, "All the paperwork to transfer management of the properties is ready," he said. "Tomorrow we'll visit the 3 main buildings first." I thanked him. When I returned to my room, someone had brought in a navy blue suit, new and neatly pressed. I held it up in front of the mirror, and for a moment, I didn't recognize the woman looking back at me. Before going to sleep, I opened the second envelope Eugene had left, just a few short lines. "If anyone ever hurts you, remember that you are not alone." I clenched the paper in my hand, laid it on the nightstand, then turned off the light. That night, I slept straight through. Not cold, not afraid, not jolted awake by police sirens or people shouting outside. The next morning, sunlight slipped through the thin curtains. My phone vibrated. "I'll be there to pick you up in 30 minutes. Today, we begin. Clarence." I put on the navy suit and took a deep breath. For the first time in many years, I no longer felt like I was being pushed away. I was actively stepping towards something new, bigger, clearer, and truly mine. As the door of the suite closed behind me, I knew this was not the ending. This was the starting point of an entirely different life. The next morning, I went down to the hotel lobby in the navy blue suit Clarence had told me to wear. The fabric held onto my body in a strange way, as if I were borrowing someone else's life for a while. Clarence was already waiting by the sofa, a thick briefcase in his hand. When he saw me, he nodded. "Good morning, Mrs. Ale. Today will be a long day." The black sedan was waiting outside. I got into the back seat, still feeling a bit awkward at being treated like someone important. Clarence handed me a folder. "We'll visit 3 main buildings, South Shore Residences, Hyde Park Towers, and Bronzeville Apartments. I want you to see how they operate, who manages them, and the decisions you can make as the owner." The car slid along Michigan Avenue. Clarence summarized rental prices, housing demand, the condition of each building. I listened to every point. At my age, I no longer had the luxury of not understanding South Shore Residences was a red brick building that, at first glance, looked fine, but had stains and marks my eyes of someone who had spent her life cleaning and repairing, couldn't ignore. The manager, Daryl Knox, came out to greet us and shook my hand. "Nice to meet you, Mrs. Ale. I wasn't told you'd be visiting today." Clarence simply added, "From now on, she'll be involved in every important decision." As we walked down the hallway, 2 light bulbs above us flickered. Daryl sighed. "We've requested replacements, but we're still waiting on budget approval." Clarence looked at me, leaving the decision to me. "Get it done today," I said. "Don't make tenants walk in a dark hallway." Daryl hesitated for a moment, then smiled more genuinely. "Thank you, ma'am. I'll call the electrician right away." For the first time, I wasn't the one being told to fix a broken light bulb. I was the one giving permission for it to be replaced. The second stop was Hyde Park Towers. A few workers were standing on scaffolding, repainting the facade. The manager, Letitia Moore, led us to the systems room, then pulled out a list of tenants behind on rent. I looked down, and the third line seemed to freeze in front of my eyes. Bryson Watkins, Unit 3B, 1 month behind on rent. Clarence glanced at me. "How would you like to handle this?" A part of me wanted to blurt out, "He threw his mother-in-law out on the street and can't even pay his rent?" But all I said was, "Follow the usual process. No special treatment. No exceptions." Letitia nodded. "I'll send the second notice today." I left Hyde Park with a cold stone sitting in my stomach, but I stayed silent. I had decided. Emotions had no place where principles should stand. The third building was Bronzeville Apartments. The moment we turned in, I recognized it. I had once changed a light bulb here when Nia first moved into her first apartment. The manager, Andre Phillips, walked us past the mailboxes and opened the management app on his tablet. A spreadsheet appeared with several red cells. Right in the middle of those names was a line that hit me like a punch. Unit 3F, Watkins and Ale. My heart tightened. That was Naya's apartment. The place where Bryson had set my suitcase by the door like a package that needed to be taken away immediately. "What's the situation with the tenants in 3F?" I asked. Andre lowered his voice. "The husband is very hot-tempered, often yells. The wife always looks scared of him." I nodded. "Handle it strictly by the law. No exceptions." Andre gave a small nod. He understood. This wasn't about doing a favor for family. At noon, Clarence took me to a small sandwich shop nearby. As we ate, he explained more about cash flow, expenses, and how to balance compassion with principles. Then he handed me a sheet of paper. "This authorizes me, temporarily, to send rent adjustment notices on your behalf for all the properties, just for the initial phase until you get used to managing everything." I signed. It felt like I was stepping one more level into the world Eugene had quietly prepared for me. In the afternoon, Clarence took me to buy a new phone, with a separate number just for business. "No one trusts a landlady who doesn't have a proper contact number," he joked. Back at the hotel, I opened my email. Over 150 pages of reports. I stopped at the item. Bronzeville Apartments, rent adjustment notice. The notice had been sent. Below it was a list of responses. The first line, Bryson Watkins, voicemail at 6:47 p.m., requesting a meeting with the property owner. I stared at that line for a few seconds, my finger resting on the part where I could tap to listen. Then I closed it. Not because I was afraid of his voice, but because for the first time in my life, I wanted him to feel what it was like to wait for my decision, instead of me always being the one waiting for his judgment. That evening, I stepped out onto the balcony. The car lights below stretched into long streaks. The city was still noisy, but inside me was a strange kind of calm. My second day as a landlady came to a close. I knew there would be many more decisions ahead, more confrontations, more pains I didn't yet have names for, but this time, beneath all the worry, I no longer felt afraid. I just felt that at last I was standing exactly where I was meant to be, the place Eugene had quietly prepared for me long ago, and I was simply the last one to find out. The next morning, the same navy blue suit from the day before was still hanging behind the door. I put it on, adjusted the collar in front of the mirror, then went down to the lobby to meet Clarence. He was already waiting, a black briefcase in his hand, eyes lowered as he reviewed a stack of papers. When he saw me, he looked up and nodded, stern but warm. "Today we make everything official," he said, as the two of us stepped out onto the street. The familiar black sedan was parked out front. The driver opened the back door for me. This time, I was no longer as stunned as in those first days, but there was still a small sting in my chest, as if that leather seat still did not truly belong to me. The car merged into Chicago's morning traffic. Clarence went over each step of the legal process again, establishing the legal entity, powers of attorney, filings with the city. We arrived at the office building where Ladle Properties LLC would officially be set up. In the conference room, there was a stack of documents so thick it could have been used to prop a door open. The attorney in charge of registrations brought in 6 large binders. "Each of these needs your signature, Mrs. Ladle. Here, here, and here," he said. I sat down and picked up the pen. It took over an hour just to sign. Several times my hand grew tired, and I had to stop, breathe deeply, roll my wrist, then keep going. Clarence explained the clauses as we went, patiently answering every small question I had. There were terms I had never heard in my life, concepts belonging to a world Eugene had quietly stepped into years ago, while I was still hunched under sinks and scrubbing kitchen floors for other people. When we finally finished signing, Clarence opened his laptop and checked emails from the 3 building managers. He scrolled through a few messages, frowning slightly. "Most tenants have accepted the adjusted rent," he said. "A few have minor questions." He stopped, the corner of his mouth lifting a little in a figures kind of way. "And here is an email from Bryson Watkins." My chest tightened, but my face stayed calm. Clarence lowered his voice. "He is threatening to sue the landlord for abusive rent increases and harassment," and he added one line, "He has no idea who you are." Inside me rose a hot and cold tangle of feelings. Not quite satisfaction, not exactly anger, more like a bitter taste I knew too well. Disappointment, exhaustion, and an old sadness, now coated with a thin layer of irony. "Proceed strictly according to the law," I said softly. "I do not want any exceptions." Clarence nodded, closed the laptop, and slipped it into his briefcase. "Now we'll visit 2 more buildings," he said. We stopped by a small building in Englewood, its facade lined with hanging flower pots, its balconies narrow. After that, we went to an older building farther south, with an elevator that looked like it had been stuck in the 1970s. In Englewood, as we walked down the hallway, an elderly woman with a cane slowly made her way toward us, each step dragging a lifetime of weariness behind it. "I'm Mrs. Ellis," she introduced herself, her voice hoarse, but still carrying a hint of humor. "The elevator here is practically broken down every day. My knees can't handle 3 flights anymore." I looked at her legs, then at the elevator button, its lettering almost rubbed off. "I'll have someone inspect and fix it today," I told her, looking straight into her eyes. "I promise you." Mrs. Ellis gently took my hand and gave it a small squeeze. It was a light touch, but it carried more weight than any polite "thank you," like a person pushed to the margins of society, long used to being invisible, suddenly being seen. As we left the building, Clarence received a text. He glanced at the screen, exhaled quietly, then handed me the phone. It was from Andre, the manager at Bronzeville Apartments, Unit 3F, 2 months behind on rent. Final notice has been sent. My heart clenched again. 3F, where Naya lived. The place where Bryson had set my suitcase by the door, like a parcel that had to be taken away immediately. "Do you want to wait before starting the eviction process?" Clarence asked. He did not push. He left the choice to me. I shook my head. "No, follow the regulations. No delays." Of course, it hurt on the inside. That was my daughter's home. It was my son-in-law's name on the lease. That was the place where they had called me a burden. But I knew that if I kept going soft, I would only be watering the mold that had been eating into the wood for years. That afternoon, Clarence filed the request for an eviction hearing, not just for Unit 3F, but also for 2 other units with long-standing arrears. I signed everything with a calmness that surprised even me. 3 days later, a message came from Clarence. Hearing date, Friday, 9 a.m. If you hear this and find yourself asking, as a mother, how could she sign a paper to evict her own child? Then remember this. For months, the person thrown out onto the street without paperwork, without a hearing, without a lawyer, without a single voice defending her, was me. This time, I was not striking back with rage. I was using the law. The only thing here that does not care who is mother, who is child, who is wife, who is husband. And sometimes, to pull a child out of the arms of a manipulator, you have to let her touch the very bottom of consequence. We arrived at the courthouse earlier than the scheduled time. Inside, it smelled of damp walls, old paper, and cheap coffee. Clarence and I sat on a bench toward the back. I hunched a little, not because I was afraid, but because I didn't want to draw attention. 10 minutes later, Bryson and Naya walked in. Bryson wore a wrinkled shirt, patchy stubble on his face, eyes bloodshot like someone who had not slept for days. Naya followed behind, clutching a folded stack of documents in both hands, her eyes fixed on the floor, as if simply lifting her head would cause her to shatter. She did not look around once the whole time. Bryson kept making calls, talking fast, his voice sharp. His leg bounced constantly. Now and then he slapped the back of the chair in front of him, each thud cold and harsh. I watched them from a distance, my chest hollow. It was no longer the anger of a mother being insulted. It was the bitter pain of watching her daughter's life wrung dry, twisted out of shape. When the clerk called the case related to Unit 3F, Bryson jumped up, yanking Nia along by the arm. They walked right past the row where I was sitting without noticing me at all. He carried with him the smell of stale coffee and thick, sour stress. In front of the judge, Bryson abruptly switched roles. His voice high, his gestures theatrical. "This landlord is completely inhumane, Your Honor," he declared. "He raised the rent without warning, for no reason. He is harassing us, a family with a small child." Nia startled and looked up. They did not have a child. I saw the corner of her mouth tremble, as if she wanted to say something, but it died instantly. I wanted to stand up to say, "He is lying, Your Honor." But Clarence laid a light hand on mine, a touch so gentle, yet enough to remind me, "Stay calm, let the truth speak." The judge asked Bryson to provide proof of payment. He tapped his phone, swiped the screen, rummaged as if the receipts would magically appear. But in the end, there was nothing. Naya tried to speak, her voice shaky. "We are just going through a difficult time financially." Bryson turned to her and mouthed each word slowly enough for me to read his lips. "Shut up. Let me talk." Clarence stepped forward and presented the complete file. The lease agreement, all notices sent, the rent adjustment in line with the market, the record of outstanding payments. The judge reviewed them long enough to see the picture clearly. "Unit 3F, he said, his voice steady. 2 months of unpaid rent, no evidence of payment. The court orders eviction within no more than 10 days. Bryson slammed his hand on the table. The sound cracked through the courtroom. "One more outburst like that, Mr. Watkins, and I will hold you in contempt of court," the judge warned, his eyes cold as steel. Nia broke down in tears. She lifted her hand as if to ask for more time, her words swallowed by sobs. "Please, Your Honor, if you could just—" 10 days, the judge shook his head. "I cannot grant more." The hearing ended quickly. Bryson stormed out, kicking a chair in the hallway so hard it skidded across the floor. Nia followed behind with small steps, one arm hugging the folder, the other wiping her tears. I watched their backs grow smaller, and they still had no idea I was sitting right there, close enough that all they would have had to do was turn around. Clarence gathered the paperwork, then tilted his head toward me and asked quietly, "Would you like to speak to them now?" I stayed silent for a few seconds, my eyes fixed on the door they had just gone through, as if I could still hear Nia's small footsteps echoing down the hallway. "No," I said at last. "Not yet." We left the courthouse. The wind swept across the front steps, carrying dry leaves and tugging lightly at the hem of my coat. In the parking lot, the black sedan was waiting. "Are you all right?" Clarence asked once we were seated. "I am," I replied. "I am exactly where I need to be." As the car pulled away, Clarence's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, silenced it, and placed it face down on the console. "Bryson," he said, his voice low. Another message. Still that same mix of threats and pleading, a man too blind to understand that the power he thought he held over others is collapsing because it was never truly his in the first place. Through the window, the courthouse shrank behind us. Clouds moved quickly across the sky. A single ray of sunlight broke through, landing right on the crosswalk ahead. I took a deep breath. "Clarence," I said, still looking straight ahead, "I think it's time." He nodded, not asking what I meant, as if he had been waiting for that sentence for days. "Then we'll prepare everything," he replied. In that moment, I knew. The next step would no longer be about papers, numbers, or reports. It would be personal. Very, very personal. The morning after the hearing, I received a text from Clarence at 7:12 a.m. Bryson called again. He insists on meeting the owner. I replied immediately, "Set up a meeting, office 1447. I put on the navy blue suit they had prepared for me, the outfit I hadn't even dared to touch 2 weeks earlier, then followed the driver to the glass building Clarence was waiting outside the room, placing 3 thick folders on the table, one of them with Eugene written on it in his handwriting. Just seeing it was enough to make my heart tighten. "Sit here," he said. "Keep these documents right in front of you. I want him to see everything." In less than 10 minutes, the receptionist notified us, "Bryson Watkins has arrived. He's on his way up in the elevator." The door swung open without a knock. Bryson stepped in, looking restless, his shirt wrinkled, dark circles under his eyes. Nia followed behind, her eyes swollen as if she hadn't slept. Bryson took 2 steps and then froze when he saw me. It took Nia an extra beat to react. She lifted both hands to her mouth. "Mom, what are you doing here?" I looked at her, not answering right away. The feeling was both painful and sharply clear. Bryson turned to Clarence, snapping, "I asked to see the owner, not her." Clarence answered immediately, "She is the owner, co-owner of all 13 properties." The room fell silent. Bryson stammered, "She is the owner?" "That's right," Clarence said. "Her husband, Mr. Eugene Ale, built this portfolio over more than 30 years. Nia dropped into a chair, the folder slipping from her hands. She looked at me as if she had just lost the one steady point in her world. "Why didn't you tell me, Mom?" "I never had the chance," I replied. "And you know why." Bryson tried to regain control, forcing a rational tone. "All right, let's talk like adults. Everything can be worked out." I pushed the stack of court orders and overdue notices toward him. The papers said everything on their own. Bryson glanced through them and stopped when he saw Eugene's signature. His expression changed immediately. Nia began to cry. "Mom, I'm sorry, I was scared." "What were you scared of losing?" I asked directly. "Scared of losing your husband? Scared of losing the apartment? Or scared of facing the truth that you let your mother sleep on the street?" My daughter broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. Seeing things take a bad turn, Bryson switched tactics. He dropped to his knees beside his wife's chair, wrapped an arm around her shoulders, trying to fashion himself into her last shield. "Think about Nia. You don't want to break your daughter's heart, do you?" I looked at him, then at Nia, crying in the arms of the man who had pressed a hot ladle against her mother's hand. And I knew Bryson hadn't changed at all. He was just using my daughter one more time. I stood up. Clarence rose with me. "Nia," I said slowly, "I love you, but I cannot save you, if you don't want to save yourself." I looked straight into her eyes. "The court's decision is 10 days, no exceptions. Not because I want revenge, but because you need to learn that in this life, anyone who does something cruel has to pay the price." My daughter buried her face in her hands. Bryson shouted something behind me. I didn't turn back. Clarence opened the door. It closed softly. In the elevator, he looked at me. "You did it." I nodded. My chest felt as heavy as stone, but I knew I had made the right choice. 3 months after that confrontation, my life had changed in ways I couldn't have imagined, not even in my dreams. I was no longer living in a hotel. Clarence had helped me find a small house in South Shore, the very neighborhood where Eugene and I had raised Nia. It was a 1-story house with a brown shingle roof, a little front yard with a few small bushes, and a stone path leading straight to the door. The first time I slid the key into the lock, a faint smell of new paint wrapped around me. The living room was small but bright, with a big window looking out onto the backyard. The kitchen had light-colored wooden cabinets, a new electric stove, and a countertop where I could immediately picture myself making coffee in the mornings. Clarence brought over the final set of documents and the official keys. "Starting today, this is your home," he said. I signed each page slowly, a sense of peace spreading through my chest. I hung my shirts in the closet, folded my clothes neatly into the drawers, and it felt like I was gently taking back each small piece of control over my life. That afternoon, I went grocery shopping: bread, vegetables, chicken, and a small pot of yellow flowers. I set the flower pot on the kitchen windowsill, right where the afternoon sunlight poured in. As I was bending down, pulling weeds in the backyard, an older woman appeared by the fence. "I'm Martha," she smiled. "I live on the corner. If you'd like, I've got a better pair of shears for trimming those branches." That simple kindness made me think of the days when I believed the world no longer had a shred of goodness left for me. That evening, I turned on the porch light and sat on a wooden chair, looking out at the neighborhood. The stillness was so different from the nights I slept on the street. Here, there was no fear, no rushed footsteps, only the soft wind and the distant sound of cars. My phone buzzed. A message from Clarence. "Bryson and Nia have vacated Unit 3F. The manager has changed the locks." I replied, "I understand." There was no gloating, no sense of victory, just the feeling that a chapter of my life had finally closed for good. That night, I stood leaning against the doorframe, watching my shadow fall across the porch steps. There are moments in life when you are not happy, not sad, you simply breathe, and you realize you are still here, still alive, still moving forward. A strange kind of peace you never knew you needed so much. 3 weeks later, I went to a volunteer center in Englewood. They gave me a jacket with the center's logo, and I joined the team preparing food trays for struggling families. While I was handing out meals, I noticed Rosa standing in line. "Oh my, look at you, Margaret," she laughed. "You look like a politician running for mayor." I laughed with her and slipped an extra portion into her bag. "I'm just starting over," I said. "That's life," she replied, her eyes shining with experience. "It takes the sharpest turns, but sometimes those turns lead us exactly where we're meant to be." It was the first time in many months that I felt I was truly giving back a piece of what I'd been given. 2 more weeks later, on a Saturday afternoon, the doorbell rang. I was kneeling in the yard, planting yellow rose bushes, the flowers Eugene always brought me on our anniversaries. When I opened the door, Nia was standing there. But it wasn't the Nia I remembered. My daughter looked different. Her hair was cut short. She wore a simple sweater. Her eyes were still sad, but there was a light in them. "Mom," she said, her voice trembling. I left Bryson. I moved out. I'm staying with a friend." I didn't ask anything. I just opened the door wider. Nia stepped inside and looked around the small, sun-filled house. She saw Eugene's photo, my old coat, and a vase of yellow roses on the table. "Mom?" Naya burst into tears. I'm sorry for everything." I hugged her tight, the way I did when she was little. I know, baby," I said. We sat in the living room. I made tea. Nia held the cup without drinking, just cupping her hands around the warmth. I thought, Nia whispered, if I tried hard enough, Bryson would change. I placed my hand over hers. No one changes if they don't want to, I said. You can only change the way you stand in front of them. Naya nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. After a moment, she looked at me with the same childlike gaze she had years ago. Mom, will you teach me how to make the stew, the one Dad liked? My heart tightened, but in a gentle way. Of course, sweetheart, I said. We went into the kitchen. I showed her how to slice carrots, chop onions, sear the meat. When the pot began to simmer, the smell filled the house. The smell of family, the smell of a peace we had once lost. I remember this smell. Naya closed her eyes. I miss Dad. I miss when everything was simple. Life isn't simple, baby, I said, but it always finds a way to get better. After dinner, we went out to the yard to finish planting the yellow rose bushes. Mom, Nia asked softly, do you regret letting me go? I looked deep into her eyes. No, sweetheart, I didn't throw you out. I only closed the door you had already walked out of. But now... I took her hand, our fingers still stained with soil. That door is always open, whenever you're ready to walk back in on your own 2 feet. My daughter laughed through her tears. I love you, Mom. I love you too, always. That night, after Naya left, I sat on the porch and watched the Chicago sky slowly fill with stars. I thought of Eugene, the man who taught me that real strength is about empowering each other, not controlling each other. I thought of Naya, my daughter, who was finally beginning to stand on her own. And I thought of myself, a 68-year-old woman who once slept on the street, who had been treated as useless, now sitting in her own home, on her own land, with a dignity no one could ever take away. I smiled, not because I had won, but because I had survived. I looked up at the sky. Do you see this, Eugene? I whispered. I've stood back up, and now it's our daughter's turn. The wind blew, carrying the scent of newly blooming yellow roses. And I knew that even though Eugene was no longer here, his love was still protecting me, just as I would always protect our daughter, not by carrying everything for her, but by teaching her how to protect herself. That was the last day I was a homeless woman, and the first day I became the woman Eugene had always believed I could be. If this story has touched you, if Margaret's journey of standing back up makes you think of yourself or of someone you love, then I invite you to stay in this home a little longer. My channel is on its way toward reaching its first 1,000 subscribers. A small number, perhaps, but to me, it is a huge encouragement. So if you want to hear more stories about lives, people, consequences, and healing, please hit subscribe, turn on the notification bell, so I have the strength to keep telling journeys like this one. Thank you, truly.